They thought they were burying England's golden prince. But when embalmers opened his chest, what poured out wasn't blood. It was pure liquid decay that had been eating him alive for months while he still breathed, still spoke, still ruled a kingdom. This is the horrifying truth about what they really found inside Henry VIII's son that was so disgusting. They sealed his coffin immediately and swore everyone to secrecy. Today, nearly 500 years later, we're breaking that silence. July 6, 1553. Greenwich Palace. The smell hit you like a physical blow before you even entered the royal bedchamber. Imagine the most putrid, rotting meat you've ever encountered, then multiply it by 1,000. That's what greeted anyone brave enough to approach the dying King Edward VI. But here's the truly shocking part. This wasn't the smell of death. This was the smell of a 15-year-old boy who was literally decomposing while he was still alive. The physicians who witnessed what came next would carry nightmares to their graves. Nightmares to their graves. When they finally opened Edward's body for embalming, his internal organs didn't just look diseased. They had turned into a liquefied soup of corruption. His lungs, once meant to fill with the breath of royal commands, had dissolved into cavities filled with black, putrid fluid that splashed out when his chest was cracked open. The liver crumbled at the slightest touch, and his heart, the heart that should have beaten for decades to come, was so enlarged and covered in lesions that even experienced Tudor physicians vomited at the sight. But this nightmare had been building for months. Picture this. The most powerful throne in Europe, occupied by a teenage boy whose hair was falling out in clumps, whose fingernails turned black and detached from his fingers, whose skin split open from the swelling, revealing festering flesh underneath. Edward VI had become a living corpse, and everyone around him knew it. Yet the machinery of power demanded the pretense continue, even as servants had to change his bedding multiple times daily because various bodily fluids leaked uncontrollably from his failing form. To understand the true horror of what happened to Edward, we need to go back to the beginning to understand just how desperately Henry VIII wanted this boy and how that desperation would ultimately doom him. Henry had already been king for 28 years when Edward was born. 28 years of watching his dynasty teeter on the edge of extinction. He had broken with Rome, declared himself head of the English Church, and executed 2 of his own wives, all in pursuit of one thing, a legitimate male heir. When Jane Seymour went into labour on October 12, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace, Henry VIII paced the corridors like a caged animal. The labour lasted over 30 agonising hours. Jane's screams echoed through the palace as she endured what contemporary accounts describe as one of the most brutal deliveries in royal history. But when Edward finally emerged, healthy and robust with the Tudor red hair and his father's strong features, Henry's joy knew no bounds. He created Edward Prince of Wales at just 3 days old and ordered celebrations that rivaled his own coronation. Wine flowed freely from London's fountains. Every church in England offered prayers of thanksgiving, and court poets dubbed the newborn the prince that shall repair the ruins of Troy. But even in those first triumphant days, there were ominous shadows. Jane Seymour never recovered from the brutal delivery, developing puerperal fever that claimed her life just 12 days after giving birth. Some whispered it was an omen that a prince born from such suffering and followed so quickly by death was marked by fate. Henry, devastated by Jane's death, but ecstatic about his son, became obsessively protective of the infant Edward. The paranoia surrounding the boy's health began immediately. Henry treated his son less like a child and more like a priceless relic that needed constant protection. Edward's nursery at Hampton Court was scrubbed with vinegar daily, sometimes twice during plague seasons. Every person who entered his presence had to wash their hands in rose water and have their health verified by royal physicians. The walls of his chambers were washed weekly with lime water to prevent disease, and his food was tested by 3 different tasters before reaching his lips. This obsessive protection created an environment that was ironically harmful to Edward's development. Isolated from other children to prevent infection, he grew up in an antiseptic bubble that prevented his immune system from developing properly. Dr. Christopher Langton would later theorize that the prince's constant illnesses might have been caused by his unnatural upbringing, kept from normal childhood exposures that build resistance to disease. The first signs of Edward's constitutional weakness appeared when he was just 4 years old. In 1541, he developed what court records carefully described as a quartan fever, likely malaria, that left him bedridden for weeks. Henry VIII flew into a murderous rage, dismissing several physicians and threatening others with execution if his son didn't recover. The boy did recover, but observers noted he never quite regained his previous vitality. His tutors reported that he tired easily during lessons, and physical activities that should have been simple for a prince, riding, archery, tennis, left him exhausted and sometimes feverish. By age 7, Edward had survived 2 more serious illnesses that court chroniclers deliberately minimized in official records. Private letters between ambassadors revealed the truth. The prince suffered from recurring respiratory infections that left him gasping for breath, mysterious rashes that covered his body in painful welts, and digestive troubles that meant he could keep down only the blandest foods. The Tudor propaganda machine worked overtime to present an image of a healthy, thriving prince, even as those close to him knew the reality was dramatically different. Portrait painters were instructed to enhance his colouring and add vitality to his features that no longer existed in real life. A complex system of body doubles was developed for public appearances when the king was too ill to attend. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, the 9-year-old Edward was thrust onto England's throne, a burden his frail body was completely unequipped to bear. Contemporary accounts of his coronation reveal telling details that the official chronicles tried to hide. The ceremony had to be shortened because the boy king was too weak to stand for the traditional duration. The heavy crown gave him severe headaches that lasted for days afterward. He had to be carried in a chair for parts of the procession route because walking the full distance was beyond his strength. Court artists were specifically instructed to paint him in poses that suggested strength and vitality, while servants were coached on how to position themselves to support Edward if he swayed during ceremonies. Edward's reign began under the protectorship of his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who immediately faced the challenge of managing not just a kingdom, but a chronically ill child monarch. Somerset's private papers, discovered centuries later, contained detailed instructions to royal physicians about concealing the king's weakness at all costs. The medical records from Edward's early reign, though deliberately vague and often written in coded language, paint a picture of progressive decline that becomes more horrifying. With the king suffered from what physicians called rheums, likely chronic sinusitis and respiratory infections that left him with constant pounding headaches and difficulty breathing. His growth was severely stunted. At age 12, he was notably smaller than his peers, with thin, almost skeletal limbs and a distended belly that suggested severe malnutrition despite having access to the finest foods in England. Most concerning were the night sweats that soaked his bedding completely through and the persistent cough that produced blood-tinged sputum, classic signs of tuberculosis that his physicians either failed to recognize or deliberately chose to ignore. The disease was already spreading through his young body like a silent assassin, destroying him from the inside while he maintained the facade of royal authority. The year 1550 marked a catastrophic turning point in Edward's health. That spring, he contracted what was officially described as a mild case of measles, but was more likely smallpox given the severity of his symptoms and the characteristic scarring left behind. For weeks, the king lay delirious with fever, his body covered in painful pustules that leaked fluid and left permanent pockmarks on his once smooth skin. But the real horror was what this illness triggered inside his body. His joints began to swell and ache with rheumatic complications, and his persistent cough worsened dramatically, now producing not just blood, but chunks of actual lung tissue that he would vomit up in terrifying quantities. It was during this illness that the power struggle between Somerset and John Dudley, soon to be Duke of Northumberland, intensified to a deadly level. Both men recognized with cold political calculation that Edward's death was not a matter of if, but when, and positioning themselves for the inevitable succession, crisis became their primary concern. Somerset was eventually executed for treason, leaving Northumberland as the de facto ruler of England, while Edward became increasingly isolated, both politically and physically. The boy king, intelligent enough to understand his deteriorating situation, wrote in his private journal about feeling like prisoner in my own palace, surrounded by those who see me not as a person, but as a temporary obstacle to their ambitions. The relationship between Edward and Northumberland was complex and ultimately tragic. While Northumberland was clearly exploiting the king's weakness for his own political gain, he also seemed to develop genuine affection for the suffering boy. He arranged for the best physicians in Europe to examine Edward, bringing in specialists from Italy, France, and the Low Countries. These foreign doctors, less constrained by English court politics, provided brutally honest assessments that survive in continental archives. Dr. Girolamo Cardano, a renowned Italian physician and polymath, examined Edward in 1552 and privately wrote that the king had perhaps 2 years, certainly no more than 3, to live. Edward himself was acutely aware of his deteriorating condition. His personal writings from this period reveal a young man desperately struggling to reconcile his earthly suffering with his devout Protestant faith. "My body fails daily," he wrote in one particularly heart-wrenching entry. "Yet my spirit must remain strong for England and for God's true religion." He threw himself into religious study and reform with an intensity that concerned even his Protestant advisors, as if trying to accomplish a lifetime of religious transformation in whatever time remained to him. By 1552, the physical manifestations of Edward's illness became increasingly impossible to hide, despite the best efforts of the Tudor propaganda machine. Foreign ambassadors reported that the king's appearance had become truly ghostly, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes rimmed with dark circles that made him look like a walking skeleton, and skin that had taken on a translucent, almost supernatural quality, through which blue veins were clearly visible. His hands trembled constantly, making it nearly impossible for him to sign documents without assistance, and he had to be propped up with multiple cushions during council meetings just to maintain the appearance of sitting upright. The contrast with portraits from just 2 years earlier was so stark that some foreign observers seriously speculated that he had been poisoned by enemies of the crown. The possibility of poisoning was indeed investigated both during Edward's lifetime and after his death in Durham. Given the enormous political stakes and the number of powerful people who stood to benefit from his demise, it was certainly a reasonable suspicion. However, every symptom he displayed was entirely consistent with advanced tuberculosis, possibly combined with what modern medicine would recognize as chronic kidney disease. The swelling of his extremities, the changes in his urine, which was described as dark and malodorous, and the accumulation of fluid in his abdomen all pointed to renal failure, likely secondary to his tuberculosis infection spreading throughout his body. By autumn 1552, Edward's condition had deteriorated to such an extreme point that even the most optimistic royal propaganda couldn't hide the brutal truth any longer. He made his last public appearance in November of that year, and witnesses were absolutely shocked by what they saw. The imperial ambassador Charles V wrote to his master the English king looked like a living corpse and predicted he wouldn't survive the winter. Edward did survive, but at tremendous cost to what little remained of his quality of life. The winter of 1552-1553 became a nightmare of unimaginable suffering that Edward endured with remarkable stoicism for a 15-year-old boy. The tuberculosis had spread beyond his lungs to his bones, causing excruciating pain that no amount of opium, the strongest painkiller available in Tudor England, could fully relieve. His spine began to curve dramatically, giving him a hunched appearance that courtiers tried desperately to disguise with specially designed clothing and strategic positioning. The infection in his lungs led to the formation of multiple abscesses that would periodically rupture without warning, flooding his throat with pus and blood that he would vomit up in such horrifying quantities that servants reported the smell in his chambers was so overwhelming they had to burn. Aromatic herbs constantly just to make the air barely bearable for human occupation. The spring of 1553 brought no relief from Edward's agony. only a terrifying acceleration of his decline into complete biological chaos. The swelling that had been confined to his legs spread throughout his entire body in a condition called anasarca that left him almost completely unrecognizable as the same person. His face became so grotesquely bloated that his eyes were reduced to narrow slits, and his fingers swelled to such an enormous size that his royal rings had to be cut off with metal tools, leaving permanent scars on his swollen flesh. The skin on his legs, stretched far beyond its natural capacity, began to weep clear fluid continuously, soaking through multiple layers of bandages within hours and requiring constant attention from traumatized servants. Modern medical knowledge recognizes these as unmistakable signs of complete systemic failure. His kidneys, liver, and heart were all shutting down simultaneously in a cascade of biological destruction. It was during these final, nightmarish months that the most macabre political manoeuvring took place around Edward's deathbed. Northumberland, recognizing that Edward's death was now imminent and that it would mean the accession of the Catholic Mary Tudor, convinced the dying king to alter the succession through the infamous device for the succession. This document attempted to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favour of Lady Jane Grey, Northumberland's daughter-in-law, in a desperate gambit to maintain Protestant rule. The document itself bears horrifying witness to Edward's deterioration. His signature degrades from a relatively firm Edward in the first draft to an almost illegible scrawl in the final version, as his swollen hands could barely maintain their grip on a pen. The psychological torture of these final months equaled the physical agony in its cruelty. Edward, raised from birth to believe in his divine right to rule and his sacred responsibility to protect Protestant England, was forced to confront his absolute powerlessness in the face of biological reality. He was king in name only, unable even to control his own bodily functions, let alone the fate of his kingdom. Attendants reported that he would sometimes cry out in delirium, calling desperately for his long-dead father or begging God to either heal him completely or end his unbearable suffering immediately. Other times he would lie completely silent for hours at a time, staring at the ceiling with eyes that observers described as already seeing beyond this world into whatever comes next. The medical attention Edward received in his final months represented the absolute pinnacle of Tudor medicine, which is to say, it was sophisticated within its own historical context, but often actively harmful by any modern standard. His physicians, led by the renowned Dr. Thomas Wendy, employed every treatment in their considerable arsenal in increasingly desperate attempts to save their dying king. He was regularly bled, sometimes losing dangerous quantities of blood that his critically weakened body could ill afford to spare. They applied blistering agents to his chest in attempts to draw out the evil humours, creating painful chemical burns that inevitably became infected and added yet another layer to his misery. Mercury, arsenic, and antimony were all administered in various experimental compounds, almost certainly hastening his organ failure rather than providing any meaningful benefit. Perhaps the most heartbreaking detail about Edward's final months was the gradual abandonment by those who had surrounded him during healthier times. Courtiers found increasingly elaborate excuses to avoid the death chamber, unable to bear the horrifying sight and overwhelming smell of their decomposing monarch. Even Northumberland, despite his political need to maintain control, limited his visits to the absolute minimum necessary to maintain his grip on power. Only a handful of servants, bound by duty and perhaps genuine compassion, remained to tend to the king's most intimate and degrading needs. These unnamed individuals, who cleaned his suppurating wounds, changed his constantly soiled bedding, and held cups of water to his cracked and bleeding lips, were the true witnesses to the full, unvarnished horror of Edward's end. By May 1553, Edward could no longer leave his bed under any circumstances. The lesions on his back from constant contact with the mattress had developed into deep pressure sores that exposed bone in several places, creating additional sources of infection and pain. His hair had completely fallen out, leaving behind a scalp covered with scabs and open weeping sores that never healed. Several of his teeth had loosened completely and fallen out of his mouth, making it virtually impossible for him to speak clearly, even when he had the strength to attempt communication. When foreign ambassadors demanded definitive proof that the king still lived, they were brought to his chamber but kept at a safe distance, able to see only a vague, barely human form beneath heavy covers, and hear weak, completely unintelligible sounds that desperate courtiers presented as royal commands. The final phase of Edward's ordeal began on July 1st, when he suffered what appeared to be a massive stroke. The entire left side of his face drooped dramatically, and he lost all ability to move his left arm or leg. His speech, already nearly impossible due to his missing teeth and swollen tongue, became completely unintelligible to everyone around him. Yet his eyes continued to track movement in the room and occasionally filled with tears, clear evidence that his consciousness remained trapped inside a body in complete systemic failure. Northumberland, in a final act of pure desperation, brought in a woman who claimed to possess miraculous healing powers, but even he must have known it was utterly futile. The woman took one horrified look at the dying king and immediately fled the chamber, reportedly saying that she could not heal what God had already claimed for himself. The final 5 days of Edward's life were a descent into a hell that witnesses would struggle to adequately describe for the rest of their lives. His body began to show signs of what modern medicine would recognize as disseminated intravascular coagulation, a condition where the blood loses its ability to clot properly. He bled spontaneously from his nose, gums, and even his eyes, creating a constantly renewed mask of blood across his face. Dark purple bruises appeared, seemingly at random across his skin, where tiny capillaries had burst under the pressure of his failing circulation. His urine, when he could produce any at all, was nearly black with blood and protein from his completely destroyed kidneys. The smell in his chamber became so absolutely overwhelming that even burning sulfur, one of the strongest odor-masking agents available, couldn't make the air breathable. Guards posted outside the door had to be rotated every single hour because many became physically ill just from the stench that seeped through the heavy oak doors. On the morning of July 6th, 1553, Edward VI's suffering finally, mercifully, came to an end. Sir John Bannister, one of the physicians present at the moment of death, recorded that the king's final moments were surprisingly peaceful after months of indescribable. His breathing simply became shallower and shallower until it stopped altogether, like a candle being quietly extinguished. There were no dramatic final speeches, no last words of royal wisdom or religious comfort. The boy who had once been England's greatest hope died as quietly and unremarkably as any common person, reduced in his final moments to nothing more than failing biology. He was 15 years old and had reigned for 6.5 years, most of them spent in declining health and increasing isolation. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death was every bit as macabre as his final months had been. The body, already in such an advanced state of decomposition, needed to be prepared for burial with unprecedented urgency. The embalming process, usually a routine if unpleasant task even for Tudor professionals, became an absolute nightmare that would haunt everyone involved. When the embalmers finally opened his chest cavity, they found internal organs so completely degraded that they practically liquefied at the slightest touch. The lungs in particular were described in contemporary accounts as resembling rotted sponges soaked in blood and pus, while the heart was enlarged to nearly twice its normal size and covered in fibrous adhesions that had to be carefully cut away. The liver and kidneys showed such extensive damage that they confirmed Edward had indeed suffered from complete multi-organ failure in his final weeks. The embalmers worked frantically through the night, using massive quantities of expensive spices, exotic resins, and powerful preservative compounds imported from across Europe, but Edward's remains were so far advanced in their decay that their desperate efforts were largely futile and cosmetic. Within just a few hours of the embalming attempt, the body began to swell dramatically with gases from continued internal putrefaction. The decision was made to seal the corpse immediately in multiple nested coffins, first lead, then wood, then another complete layer of lead, in a desperate attempt to contain both the smell and prevent the accumulating gases from causing a literal explosion that would scatter royal remains across Westminster. Even sealed within his elaborate, multi-layered coffin, Edward's body continued to torment those tasked with guarding it. Multiple guards reported hearing deeply disturbing sounds throughout the night, not supernatural moaning, but the very real and terrifying sounds of gases continuing to build up pressure inside the sealed lead caskets, occasionally releasing with sounds that resembled distant screams. The official lying in state was abruptly cancelled, ostensibly out of respect for the late king's Protestant religious sensibilities, but in reality because his body was in absolutely no condition to be displayed to anyone, regardless of their religious beliefs. Instead, an empty ceremonial coffin was shown to the grieving public, draped in cloth of gold and surrounded by heraldic achievements, while the real coffin containing Edward's actual remains was kept in a sealed chamber with only a few trusted guards who were sworn to absolute secrecy about anything they might hear, see, or smell. This cover-up extended far beyond just the immediate aftermath of Edward's death. The true extent of his suffering was deliberately suppressed for political reasons, but fragments of the horrifying truth survive in the most unexpected places. An inventory from a minor noble family describes burning the king's bedsheets rather than attempting to clean them because the bodily fluids had left stains that looked like maps of unknown countries, dark, terrible, and impossible to remove by any known method. A carpenter's detailed bill for repairs to the king's chamber includes specific charges for replacing multiple floorboards that had been irreparably damaged by corrosive fluids that had seeped through multiple layers of protective covering. These mundane, practical records speak to a level of physical dissolution that no official history would ever dare to acknowledge or document. What they really found inside Henry VIII's wasn't just a diseased body. It was the physical manifestation of Tudor England's most fundamental contradictions and deepest fears. Here was a kingdom that loudly proclaimed its divine favour and unshakable power, while its king literally rotted from within. Here was a Protestant Reformation championed by a boy whose own body was undergoing the most grotesque transformation imaginable. Here was the ultimate fruit of Henry VIII's violent obsession with male succession, a son whose corrupted, decomposing flesh made a complete mockery of his father's dynastic pretensions and dreams of lasting legacy. The boy who was specifically designed to be England's greatest hope, instead became the most disturbing symbol of human mortality at its most brutal and unforgiving. Edward VI didn't simply die. He dissolved, decomposed, and disintegrated, becoming in his final moments not a king, but a terrifying biological warning about the ultimate price of unchecked political ambition and the terrible, inescapable fragility of human flesh. No matter how royal the blood that flows through it,